year was 1999. I was sitting in my car in the senior parking lot of my high school listening to the radio on the day that the shooting happened at Columbine High School. And I remember thinking, things will never be the same. Not many years after that, I heard about a church shooting. That was astounding. These kind of things didn't happen. I thought again, things will never be the same. Now, if we look at some studies and kind of combine some of the studies, take an analysis of those, there's been an estimated 150 church shootings from 1980 until now. According to another source, there have been about 242 school shootings since 2013. Now that number might be a little bit high. They count numbers like if a gun accidentally went off, and they count suicides. But even if the number was half of that for homicides, still too many, right? We ask some tough questions after a tragedy like this happens. We say, how could people shoot up a school full of children? How could people come into a church and shoot people? These seem like they should be safe places. It's sanctuaries, literally sanctuary. It seems like it should be a safe place to go. Churches and schools seem like they should be exempt from those sort of tragedies, don't they? Shouldn't they be exempt? And so we start to ask some tough questions. We start to ask, how could God allow this to happen? Why aren't the innocent protected from tragedy? Why does it sometimes feel like evil has won? There was this Jewish author, Elie Wiesel. He was a Holocaust survivor. And he wrote a lot of books, and one of these books he wrote in the form of a play, and it was called The Trial of God. And in that book, he's got several Jewish people who, during a time of mass persecutions, lock themselves in a room, and they say, we're going to put God on trial for crimes against humanity. So they have a kind of mock trial against God. All the while, on the outside of those locked doors, there's being Jews killed out in the streets. And they keep on asking the same questions, but one question they keep on asking in the middle of all of it is they say, where is God in all of this? Every argument comes down to that one question for them. Where is God in all of this? In the midst of our suffering, where is God? So when tragedies happen, we ask some tough questions. We might have those conversations with each other. We might raise our questions to God. And sometimes we become rather demanding of answers. We want answers. We want answers to why. How could this happen? Why did these tragedies keep happening? But is that really what we want? Is answers. Sometimes after a shooting like Las Vegas or some of the other things, we start to ask these questions about how did this happen? Why did this happen? And we can get these psychological profiles of the person who does these tragedies, who does these shootings. And we say, well, did they have a mental illness? Did they have an axe to grind against somebody? Were they fired from their job? What was the reasons? And we can find out all kinds of information. We can do documentaries. We can show it on the news. Does that make it any better? Is that really what we needed in that moment? No. What we need, what we really want, is restoration. We want our dead children back. When financial ruin hits you, you can get a great analysis on one of the TV channels about why the stock market crashed, why your savings have plummeted. But the answers aren't really what you want, are they? You want your finances back. When your health fails, the doctor can come in and tell you what happened to bring you to this point, and that's good information to know. But is that the thing you want the most? No. You want to be restored. You want your health back. When we lose our loved ones, we want our loved ones back. When one of these tragedies happen on the other end of the world, on the other end of the United States, in another town about an hour away from here, we want to know that these kind of things aren't going to happen here. We want to know they're not going to make it to our doorstep. We want to know that we're going to be safe. So we want restoration. We want redemption. We want safety and assurance. Sometimes the questions that we ask after a tragedy are not based on what we really need. It's what we think that we want, what we think that we need in that moment. But you can't fault people for asking those questions. It's basic human nature for us to go, why? Why did this happen? How did this happen? And it's not surprising, really, that sometimes after a tragedy, people's faith can be rattled. We may have a strong faith when a tragedy hits. And in those initial days, we may maintain our strong faith in God. But sometimes as months wear on, let's say, for instance, you have a medical illness. As months wear on, sometimes it can be hard to hold on to the same faith. Sometimes we start to blame God. Our relationship with God can become strained. We say, why? Is God doing this to me? Did God do this to me? Is God punishing me? Is God treating me unfairly? We look at people who are the scourge of society, people who are hateful towards each other, who are shooting each other, and we say that they're in great health, and I'm not in great health. They're thriving, and I'm not thriving. It doesn't seem fair. So we start to misattribute things to God. We start to misunderstand God, and we start to say, well, maybe God's not fair. Maybe God's doing this to me. We can start to have some misconceptions about God, start to twist things in our mind because of our suffering, because of the trial that we're going through, especially as time wears on. We can start to accuse God of some things. We can start to misattribute the character of God. That's how Job's story went. Job, at the beginning of his story, Job is a strong follower of God. He has strong faith. By chapter 2, after all these things have happened to him, he still has a strong faith. And he says he will not accuse God of wrongdoing. He will not curse God. And he never does in the story curse God, but he does eventually accuse God of wrongdoing. His faith, it starts off so strong, he maintains his faith. But it starts to now come with this amalgam of doubts and struggles and trials, and he's asking these deep questions about the nature of God and of human suffering. So even though he holds on to his faith throughout his trial, he also starts to introduce some doubts and starts to have some misunderstandings about God, and he starts to ask some really tough questions. Some questions, if we're honest, sometimes we have those questions. We can look at Job and what he's going through and say, if we're honest, sometimes we've asked those questions. And we know the answer to those, but sometimes, anyway, when they're in the middle of the suffering, it's hard to accept those answers. Sometimes when you're in the middle of suffering, you start to go, why? Why is God allowing this person to thrive and this person to suffer? I know there's been times before I've lost people who are very near and dear to me, and then you see someone on TV who's gone and murdered a bunch of people, and it's a hateful thought to have, but you start to say, why was that person allowed to live when this saint was allowed to die? And sometimes we have those questions of God, and we know they're wrong, but I still have these questions, and sometimes we have doubts, and we wrestle with those, and we bring those doubts to God. We're not supposed to accuse him of wrongdoing, but sometimes in our human nature, we do falter, and we start to accuse God of wrongdoing. But I love what Job says. We mentioned this earlier before, but Job, even though he starts to incorrectly believe that God is attacking him, even though he believes that God is out to get him, he still puts his trust in God. And he says, though he slay me, I will trust in him. In some translations, I will wait for him. He might be attacking me now, but I know he's going to redeem me later. I don't understand why God is treating me the way he's treating me, but I'm going to wait for him to reveal it. So, Job holds on to this strong faith that also now has a mixture of doubts. Job, by chapter 38, he demands a hearing before God. He says, I know what I'll do. I'll take my case to court against God. I'll take my case to court, and God will look at all the evidence, and he'll see I'm an innocent person. I'm a righteous person. I didn't deserve any of this to happen to me. So, in Job's version of how this trial will go, God has mistreated him, and God is the defendant. So he's going to take it to court against God, who is also the judge. Let it sink in for a minute. God is the defendant, and God is also the judge. How's that going to work for Job? I think we probably all have done that a little bit. God, you're not treating me right. You need to bring down justice. Oh, you're the judge. Okay. But Job is about to learn an important lesson that we all can learn if we look at Job's encounter. You may have heard me say this before, but it is great if you can learn from your mistakes. It's so much easier if you learn from other people's mistakes. It's a lot less painful. So we're going to learn some things from Job's experience without ourselves taking God to court. I really love the way that David McKenna put it. And this quote is on the inside of your notes. Job needs to learn that the issue is not ethical. The question is not why, and the need is not understanding. The issue is spiritual. The question is who, and the need is trust. So maybe you've expressed some of the same questions that Job has expressed. Maybe you went through your own dark time and you've wondered, why? Why am I going through this? Maybe you felt like it was undeserved. Maybe you wondered why the guilty seem to thrive while the innocent perish. So I invite you this morning to bring those questions you may have had, maybe you even have now in this part of your life, to bring those questions to the text as we look at God's Word together this morning in Job 38. Now, again, I'll remind you there's going to be 2 loud noises in a moment. We enter into Job chapter 38. Job has challenged God. He's going to take his case to court. And he's convinced God is going to declare me innocent. God is going to declare himself guilty. In this chapter, God shows up. God shows up to this court that Job has demanded. So surely Job is going to have what he wants, right? So surely this is the moment when... So surely Job, he's brought his case to the people's court. But this courtroom drama is about to unfold. And Job thinks this is the people's court, but he's wrong. This is going to be God's court. So Job may have bitten off a little bit more than he could chew. For one thing, Job has no advocate. He's representing himself. He has recognized earlier, a few chapters earlier, he's recognized his need for an advocate, a savior, a redeemer, someone to act on his behalf, to plead between him and God. He recognizes that, and we talked about how this person would come later in the form of Jesus Christ, our advocate, our redeemer, our friend who pleads for us to God. But at this time in this text, Jesus isn't on the scene yet. So Job has taken his case to court against God, but he has no prosecuting attorney with him. Job is representing himself. He's his own lawyer. He's his own advocate. It can be pretty scary to go up against the judge by yourself. Now, I can remember a time when I entered a courtroom. And I know at this point you're thinking, oh goodness, what did we miss in his background check? It wasn't for me, actually. There was a woman in our church who was going up for drug charges. And she could not appear in court that day. Now, I don't really remember why she couldn't be in court herself. It was kind of sketchy. But me and another leader from the church, we somehow ended up going to court on this lady's behalf. We were her advocates. So we show up to the courtroom, and I'm just thankful because I remember in my 20s when I used to speed all the time and I went to traffic court and I say, I'm in court and it's not my fault. So I'm kind of relaxed. Also, I don't know if you've been in a courtroom, hopefully not, but if you go to court in the back, what does it look like? It looks like a church. There's pews. So I'm learning now about the history of the court system. You know, courts used to meet in churches after church services were over because you had all the witnesses. So I'm sitting there talking with another church leader, having a good old time. I'm watching cases go forward. I'm learning a little bit about the judicial system. And again, I'm just relaxed that I'm not in trouble. So I'm sitting there, and the DA comes up. I go, oh, this will be neat. I've never heard the DA talk before. I'm going to learn some more stuff. The DA walks up, and let me pause to tell you that this was near the coast. And coastal life, it's a very different culture. They call, for one instance, that they have a thing called island time. Island time is, I define on time as when I show up. I literally still have the t-shirt. Wearing a Hawaiian shirt and flip-flops is an acceptable attire for any occasion year-round. You don't put up Christmas trees, you put up crab pots, and you took the Christmas lights and put them on the crab pot outside of your house. It's a very relaxed culture. So that's kind of the culture we were in when we went to this courtroom. The DA walks up, and I'm sitting there feeling pretty good about it. Me and this other leader from the church. The DA gets up there, and he yells, "All right, everybody, listen up. You get up here, stand up with straight posture. If I see you come in here with a Hawaiian shirt, you'll be held in contempt of court. If I see you walk up here with flip-flops, you'll be held in contempt of court." Me and my buddy were looking at each other, oh my gosh. Are we dressed all right? Do we have to go home and change clothes? We're a little bit nervous. He says, "If I see you on your cell phone, you'll be held in contempt of court." At this point, I was just waiting. I had my phone sitting on my lap, and it lights up. My buddy says, "Turn off your phone." I said, "No, we're going to jail. I didn't do anything." But I felt like I was going to jail. I was going to be held in contempt of court. In a courtroom, I have never been so innocent but felt so guilty in my life. So here I was to be an advocate for another person. And I'm being intimidated by the DA and the judge. I haven't done anything, but I feel like I'm going to jail today. It can be tough to go up against the judge. So Job really needs an advocate, but he doesn't have one. All of that intimidation that I had experienced with a DA, so much more, imagine, you would experience when you're going up before God as the judge and you've accused him of wrongdoing. What must it feel like to be Job in that moment? So let's paint a picture of what Job's courtroom might have looked like. Job is already standing in the court. He's waiting on God. He's got his table out here. If you've seen the legal dramas, you've got the table out in front of you, right? You usually have a space for your attorney. If there's not one there, there's just an empty seat. But he's got his table. He's got his documents out there. And I imagine Job's got his file folder. And he's got all of the papers, all of the examples of his righteousness, his innocence. And he feels pretty good about it. He's dressed up as best as he can, even though he's been in sackcloth and ashes. He's dressed up for court, and he's got his file folder spread out there. He's going to make his case against God. I am innocent. God is going to be impressed by what I've got here. He's going to declare me innocent. He's going to declare himself guilty. He's going to let me off the hook, make all my suffering stop, and he's going to say, "I'm sorry, my bad, Job. I was wrong." But in walks God with a flash and a thunder. Can't really imagine indoor lighting there, but imagine candles, and all of the candles are snuffed out by the wind of his presence as he enters the courtroom. With every step, the ground shakes. We know from Scripture, from instances where we describe God, that when God speaks, the earth seethes and trembles, and the mountains melt like wax before the Lord. So if that is what occurs for the whole earth, what's going on inside Job this point? His insides are melting like wax. He's going, what have I got myself into now? I have made surely a mistake. So God, who is the judge, and who Job tried to make the defendant, he speaks. In verse 1 of chapter 38, he says, "Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me." So Job thought he was going to put God on trial in this moment, but God flipped the script. God says, "You're taking the stand. I'm going to ask the question here, and you will answer me." He says, and depending on your translation, gird up your loins or brace yourself like a man. In other words, for chapters 3 through 37, you had these intellectual debates about theology with your friends, and you thought that was a challenge. Oh, you're going up before God. Brace yourself. Get ready. He's saying, Job, do you really want to do this? Get ready. He said, "You're going to take the stand. I'm going to question you. You're going to answer me." Now, Job had made a couple different charges against God. Number one, he questioned the way God ran the universe. And number two, he questioned God's goodness. So God gives a series of responses that both illustrates his command of the universe and also illustrates his care for the universe. If he's going to talk about a deer, he's going to talk about how he made the deer, how you can't understand how a deer works, but he's going to talk about how he feeds the deer. So God begins with Exhibit A. And you might imagine, if you've seen these courtroom dramas, the easel with the large board up. I don't have that because it would probably be hard to read, but you've got it on the inside of your notes. God puts up Exhibit A. He asked Job 18 questions that Job is ill-equipped to answer. 18 questions divided into two sections. The first 11 questions deal primarily with non-living things like mountains. Things like, where were you when I designed and built the earth? Do you know where light and darkness dwell? Do you cause rain and lightning and give people wisdom? So God is asking all of these really tough questions to Job. The next 7 questions deal primarily with God's order in living things. Things like, do you feed lions and their cubs, or the ravens and their young? Did you give the warhorse abilities for battle? So God has put Job on the stand, and he's asking them a series of very tough questions. Again, imagine yourself in Job's shoes. This isn't going at all what you expected. You expected to put God on trial for crime against humanity, specifically you. And now you're on the stand, you're having to defend. And God has asked you 18 questions about things you cannot possibly begin to understand. And this is just Exhibit A. And the point here that God makes, if you can't understand the inner workings of the universe, you are not qualified to tell me that the inner workings of the universe are wrong, that I'm managing it wrong, that I built a clock incorrectly. The point he's making in Exhibit A is, you're not an expert witness, Job. You're not an expert. You don't know what you're talking about. And you're charged that I'm not running the universe correctly. You don't know. God gives a series of questions basically saying, do you understand how this works? Tell me where I went wrong on the inner workings of the universe. So now we're 2 chapters in to God's opening statements. And God probably moves over from Exhibit A and goes to stand in front of Job, and Job is pale with fright, I would imagine. In chapter 40, the Lord said to Job, will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? Let him who accuses God answer him. In other words, Job has made some accusations. He's brought charges against God. And the accused has the legal right to face their accuser. So Job is the accuser. God has the right to defend himself and to face his accuser. This passage shows us that this is far more about God's rights than it is Job's rights. Now before God launched into his questions, he said, I'm going to ask the questions and you're going to answer me. And now's the moment. Now's the moment where Job has to answer these 18 questions that God posited in front of him. But Job has no control over the universe. God is essentially saying, since you have control over the universe, since you have such understanding, since you understand all things, why don't you give me an answer, Job? Why don't you tell me how I built this incorrectly? And of course, Job has no answer to that. In verse 3, then Job answered the Lord, I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more. So Job realizes, I've misspoken, I have no answer. I'm in over my head. I'm not even worthy of speaking, much less providing any kind of satisfactory answer to these questions you put out there. Next to you, I'm nobody. I had this intern that used to work with me down in South Carolina. And it's a small world. He's actually a youth minister down at Red Oak Baptist now. His name's Nate. And I've told the story about Nate before. Back when he was an intern working with me in youth ministry, Nate always smelled great. I don't know what kind of cologne he put on, but he smelled wonderful. And so we'd be side by side building something. And instead of smelling like sweat, I'd smell like this great smelling cologne. And I'd think, next to Nate, I'd probably stink. I wasn't wearing a lot of cologne, so I started putting on cologne because I thought, by comparison, if you walk down the line of people and you pass Nate and you get to me, by comparison, I probably stink next to Nate. So I had to kind of up my game a little bit. I had to, not that I was trying to compete or anything with that, but I wanted to not stink when people come. So, by comparison, I went and talked to Nate, and then I went to talk to Pastor Travis, and I wish I hadn't. So Job realizes that next to God, he stinks. Next to God, he's nobody. Next to God, he is the bottom of the bottom. He can't even compare. But for Job, there's no way to up his game. He can't spray on some cologne to kind of smell a little bit better. There's nothing that Job can do to be on the same level with God. He will forever be inferior. So still, those questions that Job asked earlier are still floating out in the air. He asked all these questions of God. None of those have been answered. They're just kind of floating in the air. But notice this, Job doesn't say, after God has leveled these questions to him, after God has demanded an answer of him, what does Job not do? Job doesn't say, excuse me, but you didn't answer my question. Job doesn't do that. He's in the presence of God. Now, Job is realizing at this point it's not the people's court, it's God's court. And that God will guide what goes on here. Job puts his hand over his mouth, lest he say something else that he shouldn't say. So God launches into his next statements. He tells him once more in verse 7, brace yourself. Which if I was Job, I'd be terrified. Brace yourself again. It's going to keep going. In verse 7, he's basically saying, get ready, brace yourself. I will question you and you will answer me. And look what he says to Job here in verse 8. Would you discredit my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself? I feel like in that verse, God has cut through a whole lot of shields and facades and the mask that we all might put on. And he cuts to the heart of what not just what Job might do, but what we might do. Do you ever discredit others to make yourself look better? Maybe your friends, maybe your family, maybe even God. You blame somebody else in order to divert time away, attention away. You know, we had a recent, seems pretty recent anyway, political banter, and we see a lot of blame cast about. And we see that every day, especially in politics nowadays. And I'm not trying to take a political side, but just to say, I think we can all agree, there's a lot of blame goes around in politics. It's their fault, it's their fault, it's their fault. And we can say the politicians do that, but we do that too. We blame people. Maybe in the heat of an argument, you bring up something from the ancient past in an argument to divert attention away from yourself. You go to the archaeological site and you dust it off and you pull out the ancient relic. You put it in a glass display case. You put a special light on it. Behold, Exhibit A. I know that you called me out for something, but look at what I found from ancient past that you did. This piece is from the Roman period. It was from when we were roaming around IKEA and you wouldn't let me buy that lamp. We're excellent at diverting attention away from ourselves. I imagine a scenario where someone's in a corporate building and there's a fire. And what do you do if you're in management and there's a fire? Well, whose fault is it? Maybe it was the IT department. They didn't wire it up right. Maybe the OSHA inspector didn't inspect it right. Maybe there was a secretary or an intern, there's some kind of employee that I can blame for the building catching on fire. By the time you've listed everybody you can blame, the building's burned down around you. Maybe it's ancient man's fault for discovering fire. Maybe it's God's fault for letting them. But we burn down the building around us because we're so focused on blame. God continues his argument against Job. He brings up Exhibit B. He asks a series of questions that can basically be summed up by saying, do you think you can do a better job at this than I am? I'd love to see you try. Come on, Job. Show me how it's done. He lists out strong and terrifying creatures. He says, I created creatures that nobody can tame, but surely you, Job, you know what's going on. You can throw a saddle on this. You can throw a leash on this. I love the examples he gives, and I encourage you to read this in the text. He says to the effect of, you want to grab one of these fierce monsters that nobody can tame and put it on a leash and bring it as a pet in your royal household? You want to do that, Job? Is that the power that you have? Why won't you give it a try? So God concludes his Exhibit B. He challenges Job. Why don't you do this better than I'm doing? Why don't you show me how it's done, and then I will concur that you have done better than I, since you have so much understanding. Job speaks once more. Chapter 42. Then Job replied to the Lord, I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You ask, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. You said, listen now, and I will speak. I will question you, and you shall answer me. My ears have heard you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. Now, up to this point, Job has asserted innocence. He says, I'm innocent, I haven't done anything. In the beginning, he hadn't. He hadn't done anything to deserve the trial. But as the time went on, he went from being innocent to accusing God of misdeeds. So he has gone from, yes, I was innocent, but now that everything has been brought to court, he's made his accusations against God, he's no longer innocent at this point. So now, at this point, he repents. He has brought those false statements against God, but he repents from it. He realizes that he needs God's help. He realizes that he's in a place of sin. He needs the help of God. He needs to throw himself on the mercy of the court. That court being God alone. Now I wonder, have you ever done that? Have you ever thrown yourself on the mercy of the court of God? Have you realized your need for grace and mercy and say, you know what, before God, standing before God the judge, I can't stand before God the judge. I can't plead my case. I can't show my innocence. God has the full track record. He knows all of my mistakes. I can't plead before God for myself, but I can trust Jesus, who has come and he died on the cross to pay the ultimate penalty for my sins, to pay my court cost, to pay my bail, to stand in between me and God and to plead on my behalf that I might be found innocent. Not that I am innocent, not that I have deserved this, but I follow Jesus Christ, who is innocent, who represents me. When God looks at me, he doesn't see me, he sees his Son and declares me not guilty, that I've been covered over in the blood of Jesus Christ. Have you thrown yourself on the mercy of God's court, realizing that there's no way that you can stand there before God? See, the whole point when we look at this passage, if you look at the end of the story of Job, we might sum up the story of Job in 3 chapters, but we'd be missing a lot. If you look at just Job had everything going for him, chapter 1. Job had everything taken away from him in chapter 2. And then you skip to the end of the chapter, to the end of the book, and say, well, God gave Job everything back. Well, you'd be missing a lot of the story. You'd be missing his trial, his struggles with his faith. You'd be missing the reconciliation between him and God. And that's the point. If you take the entire context of the entire book of Job, the part where Job gets all his stuff back, it's a footnote. There's not a lot said about it, is there? It's almost an afterthought because it's not the main point of the story. The main point is not, and God gave Job some stuff. The main point is, God gave Job a deeper faith than he ever had before. God restored Job, but it wasn't just about his physical health. God restored Job in his faith. God restored Job to a deeper understanding and relationship with himself. The question wasn't, how does Job get his stuff back? It wasn't about stuff. It was about his relationship. That's what's most important in the story. So as you may go going through some trials in your own life, and you might say, I want restoration in my body. Think about the times in the New Testament when Jesus healed somebody. What did Jesus do? He never said, okay, you're healed, bye, and then wandered off. No. Jesus healed people in their body, but most importantly, he healed people in their soul. That was the most important part of that story. We call him the great physician, but it's not in the literal sense that the most important thing about Jesus is he was a good doctor. No. It's about the healing that he did in here, the healing that he did in the soul. The people that he healed, they might be dead and gone, but the legacy of what Jesus did in their life, that's what's important. That's what we still talk about today. We worship a God who has thrown out our record of wrongs, who heals us, who restores us, who redeems us, who is our advocate and friend. Everything that Job was looking forward to. It's not about stuff. It's not about restoration. It's not about answering the question of why did this happen? How did this tragedy happen? It's about the answer of who. Who do we put our trust in? What do we do when tragedy strikes? We've seen in the book of Job, there was this tension that was building and building and building. And those questions that Job asked were hanging in the air. They're never answered because they're not the most important questions. The question is, what do I do when I encounter suffering? How can I go before God? What should my relationship with God be in the midst of suffering? We see it's okay to question. It's okay to ask God, what am I supposed to be learning in the midst of this? What do you want to do inside of me? It's not okay to charge God with wrongdoing. But it is okay to ask God, are you trying to mold me, to shape me into something else? Is this just for your glory? Maybe nobody did anything wrong. Is this just something that you're going to bring healing for your glory? It's okay to have those conversations with God, but not to charge him with wrongdoing. Now, perhaps based on some things that we talked about this morning, you'd like to start that relationship with God. Maybe you don't have a relationship with God. You say, He's my advocate, He's my redeemer, He's my friend. You know what? I do want that relationship with Him. I've never had that, but I want that relationship. I can't stand before God the judge. I need my redeemer, my advocate, my friend. So I hope that you won't leave here today without establishing that relationship with the God who saved you, who put His life out there, who died and was resurrected for your sins to pay what none of us could ever pay in court. So if you don't know Jesus today, I hope you'll accept Him today. I would love to talk to you this morning as we sing our final song. If you don't feel comfortable coming up to the altar, I hope you will. But if you don't, I'll be at the door later. So I hope to get the opportunity to talk to you then. Or maybe you have a relationship with Jesus Christ, but you would like to join this church. You say, I want to make this my home. I want to be encouraged by brothers and sisters in the faith alongside of me. We'd encourage you to do that. Whatever it is that God is leading you to, don't let another day go by without accepting His call. He is a friend above all others. Won't you take His hand today as we sing this next time? Please stand and worship.